Have you ever had someone you love try to take everything you've worked for right in front of your eyes? I'm talking about the people who raised you, who you trusted with your life, demanding something that wasn't theirs like it was their birthright. Well, let me tell you what happened to me on what I thought would be a simple family dinner, a night that would expose truths I never wanted to face and force me to make decisions that would tear my family apart forever. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my parents tried to claim half of my business empire in the most public, humiliating way possible, and how one simple question from my accountant revealed secrets that changed everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. I never imagined that the very people who taught me about hard work and integrity would be the ones to betray those values so completely, and I definitely never expected that protecting what I built would mean losing my family in the process. But sometimes, life forces you to choose between what's right and what's easy. And that dinner party became the moment where I had to decide who I really was and what I truly stood for. The restaurant was one of those upscale places downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and servers who refill your water glass before you even realize it's half empty. I had suggested we meet there to celebrate what I thought was going to be a happy occasion. My company had just closed a major deal that would triple our revenue over the next 2 years, and I wanted to share that success with the people who mattered most to me. My parents, my younger brother Marcus, and my business partner and accountant, Jennifer, were all seated around this large round table near the window. The evening started pleasantly enough, with small talk about the weather, my brother's new apartment, and my mother's garden that she wouldn't stop talking about. I remember feeling this warm sense of contentment, thinking about how far I'd come and how grateful I was to have my family there to witness this milestone. I was 32 years old, and after nearly a decade of grinding, failing, picking myself up, and grinding some more, I had finally built something that mattered, something that was mine. The business started as a small digital marketing consultancy working out of my studio apartment, just me and my laptop, cold calling potential clients during the day, and learning everything I could about SEO, content strategy, and social media management at night. Those early years were brutal in ways I can't fully describe. I survived on ramen noodles and black coffee, skipped social events because I couldn't afford them, and worked 16-hour days that blurred together into an exhausting marathon of hustle and hope. There were months when I wasn't sure I could pay rent, moments when I questioned whether I was delusional for thinking I could build something from nothing, and countless rejection emails that made me wonder if I should just give up and get a normal job like everyone else. But something inside me refused to quit, this stubborn belief that if I just worked hard enough, smart enough, long enough, I could create something extraordinary. And slowly, painfully slowly, things started to change. I landed my first major client through a referral from a college acquaintance, and that led to another client, and then another. I hired my first employee, then my second, and before I knew it, I was managing a team of 15 talented people who believed in the vision I was building. We moved into a real office space. Nothing fancy at first, just a renovated warehouse in an up-and-coming neighborhood, but it felt like a palace compared to working from my couch. The revenue started climbing steadily, year after year, and I reinvested almost everything back into the business, hiring the best talent I could find, upgrading our technology, and expanding our service offerings. By year 7, we had clients across 3 continents and a reputation for delivering results that exceeded expectations. I had sacrificed relationships, missed family events, and put my entire life on hold to build this company, and it was finally paying off in ways I had only dreamed about during those desperate early days. So sitting there in that restaurant, watching the candlelight flicker across the faces of my family, I felt this profound sense of achievement and gratitude. I raised my glass to make a toast, something simple about how grateful I was for their support over the years, and that's when everything changed. My father cleared his throat in that particular way he does when he's about to say something he considers important, and I noticed my mother straightening in her chair as if they had rehearsed this moment. The warm atmosphere suddenly felt different, charged with a tension I couldn't quite identify but definitely felt in my gut. My dad looked around the table, making eye contact with everyone except me, and then he said the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. He said, and I'll never forget the casual way he delivered this bomb, that given how successful the business had become, he and my mother had been discussing it, and they felt it was time for them to claim their rightful share of what I'd built. He said rightful share like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like he was asking me to pass the salt rather than demanding ownership of something they had zero involvement in creating. I must have looked confused because my mother jumped in quickly, her voice taking on that syrupy, sweet tone she uses when she wants something, explaining that as my parents, they had invested so much in raising me, in giving me the education and values that made my success possible, and therefore they deserved to be compensated for that investment. She actually used the word compensated like I was a stock that had appreciated, and they were calling in their dividends. My brother Marcus looked down at his plate, clearly uncomfortable but not surprised, which told me they had discussed this with him beforehand. Jennifer, my accountant, sat perfectly still with her professional poker face on, but I could see her mind working behind those sharp eyes, already calculating and analyzing what was really happening here. The other diners around us continued their conversations, completely unaware that my world was imploding right there at table 12. Have you ever experienced that moment when reality shifts so dramatically that you feel like you're watching your life from outside your body? That's exactly where I was, unable to fully process what I was hearing because it seemed so absurdly unreasonable that my brain couldn't accept it as real. My father continued talking, his voice growing more confident as he laid out their demands like he was presenting a business proposal rather than attempting to hijack his daughter's life work. He explained that they had consulted with someone, he didn't say who, and that person had told them that as parents, they were entitled to a significant portion of anything their child created because they had provided the foundation for that success. He talked about the private school tuition they had paid, the college education they had funded, the emotional support they had given, and how all of that represented an investment that deserved a return. The way he framed it made my stomach turn because he was reducing our entire parent-child relationship to a financial transaction, as if love and support came with strings attached and interest rates. My mother nodded along enthusiastically, adding that they weren't being unreasonable, they were only asking for 50%, which she claimed was actually quite generous considering they could ask for more. 50%. Half of everything I had built. Half of the company I had started with my own money, my own ideas, my own endless hours of work that had nothing to do with them. They wanted to walk into my life after I had done all the hard work, after I had taken all the risks, after I had sacrificed everything, and just claim half of it like they were entitled to my success simply because they had done what parents are supposed to do anyway. The audacity of it was breathtaking, and I felt this hot surge of anger rising in my chest, mixing with confusion, hurt, and a deep sense of betrayal that made it hard to breathe. I looked at my mother's face, searching for some sign that this was a joke, some indication that she understood how insane this request was. But all I saw was expectation and a kind of cold determination that I had never seen before. This wasn't the mom who had braided my hair before school or taught me how to ride a bike. This was someone else entirely, someone whose mask had just slipped to reveal motivations I had been blind to my entire life. My brother finally spoke up, his voice quiet and uncomfortable, saying that maybe we should discuss this privately. But my father waved him off dismissively, saying there was nothing private about family business, and that everyone at this table should be part of the conversation. I realized then that this wasn't spontaneous. They had planned this. They had chosen this public setting deliberately, perhaps thinking that I would be less likely to make a scene in a crowded restaurant, that the social pressure of being watched would make me more compliant, more willing to just go along with their demands to avoid embarrassment. They had weaponized my discomfort with public confrontation, and that calculated manipulation made everything so much worse. Jennifer finally spoke, her voice calm and professional in a way that cut through the emotional chaos swirling around the table. She asked my parents a simple question, her tone neutral and curious rather than confrontational. She asked them how much money they had contributed directly to the business itself, not to my education, not to my upbringing, but specifically to the company. How much capital had they invested in the business when it was just an idea? How many hours had they worked building the client base? How much of their own money had they risked when things were uncertain? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I watched my father's face change, saw the momentary flicker of something that might have been embarrassment or guilt before it was replaced by defensive anger. He started to say something about how that wasn't the point, that their contribution was more fundamental than mere money, but Jennifer held up one hand gently, asking him to please just answer the question with a number. A simple number. How much had they financially invested in the business? The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ambient noise of the restaurant around us, the clinking of glasses and murmur of other conversations that seemed to belong to a different universe than the one I was currently trapped in. My mother looked at my father, and my father looked at the tablecloth, and nobody said anything because we all knew the answer. 0. They had invested exactly $0 in my business. They hadn't given me startup capital. They hadn't co-signed loans. They hadn't provided funding during the lean years when I was barely surviving. In fact, I suddenly remembered with crystal clarity, They had actively discouraged me from starting the business in the first place. When I had told them about my plans to leave my corporate job and start my own consultancy, my father had called it reckless and irresponsible. My mother had worried about what people would think, about whether I was throwing away a perfectly good career for some pipe dream that would probably fail. They had offered exactly zero support, financial or emotional, during those terrifying early days when I was betting everything on myself. And now that the risk had paid off, now that the company was successful and valuable, they wanted to claim ownership of something they had never believed in and had contributed nothing to creating. The realization washed over me like ice water, and I felt my perspective shifting, pieces of my history rearranging themselves into a pattern I had never seen before. Jennifer wasn't finished, though, and I was grateful for her presence because I was still too shocked to form coherent thoughts, let alone articulate them. She continued in that same measured tone, pointing out that from a legal and ethical standpoint, ownership in a business typically corresponds to investment and contribution. She asked my parents if they had any documentation showing that they had been promised equity in exchange for parenting me. Any agreement that stipulated their child-rearing efforts would entitle them to ownership of my future endeavors. The absurdity of the question was intentional, and I could see it landing. My father's face was turning red, that particular shade that meant he was getting angry because he couldn't get his way. And my mother had pressed her lips into a thin line, her eyes hard and calculating in a way that made her look like a stranger. Marcus cleared his throat and mumbled something about needing to use the restroom, clearly wanting to escape the increasingly tense situation. But my father told him sharply to stay seated, that this concerned all of us. I found my voice finally, though it came out shakier than I wanted, and I asked them directly why they thought they deserved half of something they hadn't built. My mother's response was quick and practiced, as if she had anticipated this question and prepared her answer. She talked about sacrifice, about how they had given up their own dreams to raise me, how my father had worked long hours at a job he hated to provide for the family, how she had put her own career aspirations on hold to be a stay-at-home mother. She painted a picture of martyrdom and selfless devotion, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. Almost. But then I thought about my cousin Rebecca, whose parents had made similar sacrifices, and who had also built a successful business, and her parents had never demanded ownership of what she created. I thought about my best friend from college, whose mother had been a single parent working 3 jobs, who had every reason to claim some kind of payback for her sacrifices, but who instead celebrated her daughter's success without expecting anything in return except maybe the occasional dinner or holiday visit. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that what my parents were doing wasn't normal. It wasn't loving. It was transactional and manipulative, and it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what parenting actually means. You don't raise children as an investment strategy. You don't provide for them with the expectation that they'll owe you financially for the rest of their lives. You do it because that's what you signed up for when you decided to become a parent, and if you're lucky, the return on that investment comes in the form of relationship and love, and the satisfaction of seeing your child thrive, not in literal ownership of their accomplishments. I said some of this out loud, my voice getting stronger as I spoke, and I watched my mother's expression shift from confidence to indignation. She accused me of being ungrateful, of forgetting where I came from, of thinking I was better than them now that I had money and success. The words stung because they were designed to sting, to make me doubt myself and feel like the bad guy for not surrendering to their demands. My father joined in, his voice rising slightly despite the public setting, saying that he had always known I was selfish, that I had always put my own ambitions above family, and that this response was exactly what he expected from me. The accusations came fast and sharp, each one calculated to hit an old wound, to trigger guilt or shame or compliance. But something had shifted inside me during this conversation, something fundamental that couldn't be undone. I was seeing my parents clearly for perhaps the first time in my life, seeing past the roles they played and the image they projected to the deeper truth of who they actually were. And what I saw wasn't pretty. I saw people who viewed relationships as transactions, who kept score and expected payment for every kindness, who couldn't genuinely celebrate my success without trying to claim it for themselves. I saw entitlement and greed dressed up as parental rights, and I saw the template for a future where I would never be free, where every achievement would come with demands, where my worth to them would always be measured in what I could provide rather than who I was. Jennifer asked another question, this one directed at me rather than my parents. She asked if I wanted to take a break, to step outside and discuss this privately before responding. I shook my head. I was done hiding from difficult conversations, Done trying to keep the peace at the expense of my own well-being. I looked at my parents and I told them no. Just no. Simple and clear and non-negotiable. I told them that I loved them, but that they had no legal, ethical, or moral claim to my business. I told them that I was grateful for my upbringing, but that gratitude didn't translate into ownership. I told them that if they wanted a relationship with me moving forward, it would have to be one based on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries, not on financial demands and emotional manipulation. The explosion that followed was spectacular in its ugliness, though kept to harsh whispers and pointed glares because we were still in public. My mother called me a disappointment and said she didn't know how she had raised such a cold, calculating person. My father said I would regret this decision, that I was making a huge mistake by alienating my family, and that I would come crawling back when I realized how alone I was. They threw every guilt trip, every manipulation tactic, every emotional weapon they had accumulated over 32 years of knowing exactly which buttons to push. Marcus sat there looking miserable, caught between loyalty to his parents and what had to be the obvious recognition that what they were doing was wrong. I wanted to reach out to him, to pull him into an alliance against this insanity, but I could see he wasn't ready for that conversation, wasn't ready to see our parents as anything other than the authorities we had been raised to obey without question. Jennifer remained calm throughout, occasionally taking notes on her phone in a way that I realized later was her documenting everything in case we needed it for legal purposes. The other restaurant patrons were definitely noticing our table now, the tension impossible to ignore despite everyone's attempts to keep voices low. A server approached tentatively to ask if everything was all right, and my father smiled tightly and said everything was fine. Thank you, in a tone that made it clear we were not to be disturbed. I felt trapped between the desire to stand up and walk out immediately and the strange social obligation to see this dinner through to some kind of conclusion. My parents were gathering their things, making a show of leaving in offense, playing the role of wounded parties who had been terribly wronged by their ungrateful daughter. My mother paused before standing, leaning in close to tell me in a low voice that I was going to end up alone, that this business I valued so much would never love me back, that I was choosing money over family and would live to regret it. The cruelty in her words was breathtaking, especially because part of me had always feared exactly what she was saying, that my dedication to my work meant I was somehow deficient in my ability to prioritize relationships, that my ambition made me less worthy of love. But I pushed back against that fear and recognized it for what it was, another manipulation, another attempt to make me feel small enough to comply with unreasonable demands. They left without saying goodbye, sweeping out of the restaurant with dramatic flair, leaving me sitting there with Jennifer and Marcus, my untouched dinner growing cold in front of me. The silence after they left was heavy and complicated. Marcus finally looked at me, and I could see he was torn, wanting to defend our parents but unable to deny what he had just witnessed. He asked me quietly if I really meant what I said, if I was really going to refuse to give them anything. I told him honestly that I couldn't give them ownership of my business, because it would be wrong, because I had earned it and they hadn't, because giving in to this demand would only establish a pattern where they felt entitled to anything I achieved. But I also told him that I wanted to help them if they genuinely needed financial assistance, that I would be happy to provide support in reasonable ways, just not through surrendering half my company. Marcus nodded slowly, and I could see him processing, trying to reconcile the parents he wanted to believe in with the behavior he had just seen. He said he needed time to think about everything, and I told him I understood, that I wasn't asking him to choose sides, but that I hoped he would think critically about what had just happened and what it meant. He left shortly after, hugging me briefly in a way that felt both apologetic and uncertain, and then it was just Jennifer and me sitting in that too-bright restaurant surrounded by the debris of a family dinner turned confrontation. Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed my hand, telling me that I had done the right thing, that what my parents had demanded was completely unreasonable, and that I should be proud of myself for standing firm despite the emotional manipulation. But proud wasn't exactly what I was feeling. I felt shaky and sad and angry and relieved all at once, this confusing cocktail of emotions that made it hard to know what to feel first. Part of me wanted to cry, to grieve for the relationship I had thought I had with my parents but was now realizing had never really existed in the way I imagined. Part of me wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, at the fact that people who were supposed to love you unconditionally could turn around and put conditions on that love so blatantly. And part of me felt free, liberated from expectations I hadn't even realized I was carrying, from the obligation to make them proud in ways that served their interests rather than mine. We talked for hours after that, Jennifer and I, dissecting what had happened and what it meant for both my business and my personal life. She told me something I had suspected but hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge, that this probably wasn't the first time my parents had shown these tendencies, just the first time they had been so overt about it. She asked me to think back over my life and identify other moments where they had displayed entitlement or manipulation, where they had made my accomplishments about themselves, where they had expected repayment for their role as parents. The memories came flooding back, little things I had dismissed or explained away at the time, but that formed a clear pattern when viewed together. The way my mother had been strangely competitive when I got my first promotion at my corporate job, making comments about how she could have had a successful career too if she hadn't sacrificed it for family. The way my father had borrowed money from me several times during the early years of my business, always with promises to pay it back, but never actually doing so, and getting defensive when I gently asked about it. The way they had both made me feel guilty for working long hours and not visiting more often, framing my dedication to building my business as neglect of family, rather than a necessary sacrifice for my future. The way they had never quite seemed genuinely happy about my success, always finding something to criticize or worry about, some way to diminish my achievements or make them conditional on their approval. I had internalized so much of their perspective without questioning it because they were my parents. And questioning your parents felt like questioning reality itself, when you're used to seeing them as authorities on how the world works. But sitting there with Jennifer, analyzing these patterns with clear eyes and an aching heart, I realized I had been conditioned to accept treatment that wasn't okay, to feel guilty for boundaries that were completely reasonable, to see my own success as somehow illegitimate unless they validated it. It was a painful revelation, but also a necessary one, the kind of truth that hurts in the moment but sets you free in the long run. Jennifer asked me what I wanted to do next, and I told her honestly that I didn't know. I wanted to protect my business, obviously, to make sure they couldn't make any legal claims that would jeopardize what I'd built. But I also wanted to leave the door open for a real relationship with them if they could ever acknowledge what they'd done and approach me with genuine respect rather than demands. I wasn't sure that would ever happen. Wasn't sure they were capable of that kind of self-reflection and change, but I didn't want to close off the possibility entirely. I also needed to figure out what this meant for my relationship with Marcus, whether he would side with them or whether he would be able to see the situation clearly and maintain a connection with me independent of their influence. These were all complicated questions with no easy answers, and I felt exhausted just thinking about them. We finally left the restaurant around midnight, and I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the evening over and over, analyzing every word and expression, trying to understand how we had gotten to this point and what I could have done differently. But the truth was, I hadn't done anything wrong. I had worked hard, built something valuable, and refused to give it away to people who hadn't earned it. That shouldn't be controversial. That shouldn't make me the villain in this story. And yet, I knew my parents would tell a very different version of events to anyone who would listen, painting themselves as devoted parents betrayed by an ungrateful daughter who had become too successful for her own good. The next few weeks were brutal in ways that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with emotional warfare. My phone exploded with texts and calls from extended family members who had heard my parents' version of what happened. Aunts and uncles and cousins I barely spoke to suddenly had strong opinions about my obligations to my parents, and my apparent selfishness in refusing to share my success with the people who raised me. Most of them hadn't bothered to hear my side of the story, just accepted whatever narrative my parents had spun and felt entitled to lecture me about family loyalty and gratitude. I tried explaining to a few of them what had actually happened, how my parents had demanded 50% ownership of a business they hadn't contributed to, but it was like speaking a different language. They couldn't or wouldn't understand why that was unreasonable. Kept circling back to the idea that as parents, mine deserved something, deserved to benefit from my success in some tangible way beyond just having a successful daughter. It was frustrating and isolating, realizing how many people in my extended family shared this transactional view of parent-child relationships, how many of them thought it was normal and right for parents to claim ownership of their adult children's achievements. I blocked most of them eventually, just to preserve my sanity, but not before the situation took a turn that genuinely shocked me, despite everything that had already happened. My mother sent me a letter, an actual physical letter in the mail, outlining their formal demand for 50% ownership of my company. The letter was written in legal-sounding language that made it clear they had consulted with someone, possibly an attorney, who had either given them terrible advice or helped them craft this document, knowing it had no legal standing but might intimidate me into compliance. The letter claimed that because they had supported me financially through college and provided the emotional foundation for my success, they were entitled to what they called derivative ownership of anything I created using the education and values they had provided. It cited no actual laws because no such laws exist, but it threw around enough impressive-sounding terms to make it seem official. The letter gave me 30 days to respond with an agreement to transfer 50% equity to them, or they would be forced to take appropriate legal action to claim what was rightfully theirs. I read it 3 times, each time feeling a new wave of disbelief that my own parents would threaten legal action against me for refusing to give them something they had no claim to. Jennifer had me forward it to the business attorney we kept on retainer, and his response was both reassuring and infuriating. He confirmed what we already knew, that they had absolutely no legal basis for their demands, that parental support doesn't create ownership rights in adult children's businesses, and that their threats were empty. But he also warned that they could file a nuisance lawsuit anyway, something frivolous that would eventually get thrown out but would cost time, money, and emotional energy to defend against. He recommended that I send a formal cease and desist letter, making it clear that any further harassment would be documented and could result in legal consequences for them. It felt surreal to be using words like harassment and legal consequences in relation to my own parents, but that's where we were. The attorney drafted the letter, I approved it with a heavy heart, and we sent it certified mail so there would be proof of delivery. I didn't hear from them directly after that, but the family harassment continued and escalated. Someone, I'm pretty sure it was my mother, created a fake social media account and started leaving comments on my company's business pages, claiming I had stolen money from my elderly parents and was refusing to support them in their time of need. The comments were vague enough that they didn't make specific false claims I could easily disprove, but damaging enough that some potential clients reached out to ask about it, concerned about the character of the person they were considering working with. I had to hire a reputation management service to monitor and respond to these attacks, to flag the fake accounts and get them removed, to publish statements clarifying that these allegations were part of a family dispute and had no basis in fact. It was exhausting and expensive and emotionally draining, especially because I knew the person behind these attacks was my own mother, someone who claimed to love me but was willing to damage my professional reputation because I wouldn't give her what she wanted. I found myself wondering if she had always been this vindictive, or if this was new behavior triggered by disappointment and greed. I wanted to believe the mother I remembered from childhood, the one who had bandaged my scraped knees and helped me with homework, was the real person, and this current version was an aberration. But the truth is probably more complicated than that people contain multitudes and the capacity for both love and cruelty, and that sometimes circumstances reveal aspects of their character that were always there, but hidden beneath layers of social acceptability and self-interest. Marcus finally reached out about 6 weeks after the restaurant incident, asking if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, hoping he had processed everything and was ready to have an honest conversation about what had happened. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our respective apartments, and I could see immediately that he was struggling with divided loyalties. He started by saying he loved both me and our parents, and didn't want to be in the middle of this conflict. I told him I understood, that I wasn't asking him to choose sides, but that I did hope he would think critically about what had happened and what it meant. He admitted that he had been uncomfortable with their demands from the beginning, that he had tried to talk them out of the dinner ambush, but they had been insistent. He said they genuinely believed they were entitled to a share of my success, that they had convinced themselves this was normal and right, and that they saw my refusal as a personal betrayal rather than a reasonable boundary. Marcus asked me if there was any compromise I would consider, any way to give them something without giving them actual ownership of the company. I appreciated that he was trying to find a middle ground, but I explained why that wouldn't work. If I gave them a large sum of money or set up some kind of regular payment plan, it would only validate their belief that they were entitled to my earnings, and there would never be enough. They would keep coming back for more because I had established the precedent that their demands could be met through pressure and guilt. I told him about the letter they had sent, about the online harassment, about all the things he might not have known about, and I watched his face change as he realized how far they had gone. He said quietly that he didn't know what to do, that he was living at home still to save money, and the atmosphere there was toxic, with our parents constantly talking about me in bitter terms and painting themselves as victims of my cruelty. He said he wanted to move out, but wasn't sure he could afford it yet, and I felt for him, trapped in the middle of a situation he hadn't created and didn't know how to navigate. I offered to help him with moving expenses and first month's rent if he wanted to get his own place, no strings attached, just because I loved him and wanted him to have the space to form his own opinions away from their influence. He looked at me with something like relief and gratitude, and I could see him realizing that the dynamic our parents had created put him in an impossible position, that moving out might be the only way to preserve his relationship with both them and me. We talked for a long time that afternoon, about our childhood, about patterns we had both noticed but never discussed, about the ways our parents' expectations had shaped us and sometimes damaged us. Marcus admitted that he had always felt less favored than me, that our parents' attention and validation had seemed to flow more freely in my direction, especially when I started achieving things academically and professionally. I told him I had noticed him pulling away over the years and had always wondered if there was resentment there. He said it wasn't resentment exactly, more like resignation, like he had accepted early on that he would never measure up to whatever standard our parents had set based on my achievements. So why try? That conversation was heartbreaking because I realized how much damage our parents' competitiveness and conditional love had done to both of us in different ways. They had pitted us against each other without us even fully realizing it, using comparison and favoritism as tools of control and motivation. I told Marcus that I loved him for who he was, not for what he achieved or how he compared to anyone else, and that I wanted us to build a relationship independent of our parents and their dysfunction. He seemed to appreciate that, and we agreed to stay in regular contact as he figured out his next steps. A few months passed, and the situation with my parents reached a kind of stalemate. They never followed through on their threat to sue, probably because any attorney they consulted would have told them they had no case. The online harassment tapered off after the accounts kept getting shut down. They stopped trying to contact me directly, and I stopped hoping they would somehow see the error of their ways and apologize. The extended family drama died down too, mostly because I had blocked or limited contact with the relatives who had felt entitled to judge me without knowing the full story. I focused on my business, which was thriving despite the personal turmoil, and I focused on building healthier relationships with people who respected boundaries and didn't view connection as a transaction. Jennifer became not just my accountant and business partner, but also one of my closest friends, someone who had seen me at my lowest and had stood by me without judgment or demands. Marcus did eventually move out of our parents' house, into a modest apartment in a neighborhood he loved, and our relationship improved significantly once he had some distance from their influence. He started building his own life, pursuing interests they had discouraged, and I could see him becoming more confident and authentic as he shed the weight of their expectations. The business continued to grow, and I made sure to celebrate each milestone with people who were genuinely happy for me rather than calculating what they could get from my success. I also started therapy to process everything that had happened and to work through the complicated grief of losing my parents while they were still alive, because that's what it felt like. Grief. They were still out there somewhere, living their lives, probably still bitter about my refusal to comply with their demands, but they might as well have been dead for all the relationship we had now. My therapist helped me understand that what I was mourning wasn't just my parents, but the idea of parents, the fantasy of unconditional love and support I had believed existed, but apparently didn't, at least not in my case. She helped me work through the guilt, the persistent voice in my head that whispered maybe I was wrong, maybe I was selfish, maybe I should have just given them something to keep the peace. She helped me see that giving in to unreasonable demands isn't peace, it's surrender, and that true peace comes from living in alignment with your values even when it costs you relationships. She also helped me recognize patterns of people-pleasing and conflict avoidance that had been shaped by growing up with parents who used love as a reward for compliance and withdrew it as punishment for independence. These therapy sessions were sometimes more painful than the actual confrontation had been, because they forced me to examine my entire childhood and adolescence through a new lens, to recognize manipulation and conditional love, where I had previously seen normal parenting. But they were also liberating, giving me tools to build healthier relationships going forward and to recognize red flags before they became full-blown disasters. About a year after the restaurant incident, something unexpected happened. My father's brother, my Uncle Tom, reached out to me privately. He said he had heard the family gossip about what happened, but wanted to hear my side directly before forming an opinion. I was cautious because I had been burned by family members before, but something about his tone made me willing to give him a chance. We met for lunch, and I told him the whole story, from the restaurant ambush to the legal threats to the online harassment, leaving nothing out. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as I talked. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and sighed deeply. He told me something I hadn't known, that my parents had a long history of financial problems stemming from poor decisions and lifestyle inflation. He said they had borrowed money from various family members over the years, often with sob stories about temporary hardships, and had rarely paid anyone back. He said he himself had loaned them a significant sum years ago that they had never repaid, and when he had finally pressed them about it, they had cut him off, claiming he was being petty and prioritizing money over family. The pattern was familiar, wasn't it? Make unreasonable demands, frame refusal as betrayal, cut off anyone who doesn't comply. Uncle Tom said he had suspected for years that they viewed their children as retirement plans or lottery tickets, potential sources of financial salvation that would eventually rescue them from the consequences of their choices. He said my success had probably triggered this response because they saw it as their opportunity finally arriving, their chance to cash in on the investment they viewed parenthood as being. He apologized for not reaching out sooner, said he should have warned me that this might happen, but he had hoped they would treat their own children better than they treated extended family. His perspective was validating in a way I hadn't expected, confirming that I wasn't crazy or ungrateful, that my parents' behavior was part of a larger pattern that had nothing to do with me specifically, and everything to do with who they fundamentally were. Uncle Tom and I stayed in touch after that, and he became part of a slowly growing circle of family members who had either experienced similar treatment from my parents or who had witnessed enough to know the truth. It wasn't a huge group, but it was enough to make me feel less alone, less like the crazy one who had somehow misunderstood what should have been a simple situation. The business hit several new milestones over that year. We expanded into 2 new markets, launched an innovative service offering that got featured in several industry publications, and doubled our employee count. Each success felt different than it might have before, tinged with awareness of how easily it all could have been destroyed by giving in to unreasonable demands. I had stood my ground, and the result was a thriving business that was entirely mine, that reflected my vision and values without compromise. I had also learned to be more careful about who I shared my successes with, recognizing that not everyone could be genuinely happy for you, that some people only saw your wins as their opportunities. It was a cynical lesson in some ways, but also a practical one that served me well in both personal and professional contexts. I started dating someone around that time, a kind and stable person who had healthy family relationships and couldn't quite comprehend the dysfunction I described from my own family. At first, I worried that this lack of understanding might be a problem, but I came to see it as a gift. She showed me what normal looked like, what it felt like to be with someone whose love wasn't conditional, who celebrated my success without trying to claim credit or compensation, who respected my boundaries without making me feel guilty for having them. Her family welcomed me warmly, and I experienced for the first time what it was like to sit around a dinner table with parents who didn't view their adult children's lives as extensions of their own egos or opportunities for financial gain. It was revelatory and healing in ways I'm still discovering. Marcus and I grew closer during this time too, bonding over our shared experiences and our determination to break the cycles we had grown up with. He started his own small business eventually, a creative venture he was passionate about, and I helped him with advice and connections, but never with the expectation that he owed me anything beyond normal sibling affection. Watching him build something of his own, seeing his confidence grow as he succeeded on his terms rather than trying to meet someone else's expectations, was one of the most satisfying experiences of my entire journey. We sometimes talked about our parents, wondering if they had any regrets or if they still saw themselves as the victims in this story. We heard through the family grapevine that they were struggling financially, which wasn't surprising given what Uncle Tom had told me about their history of poor financial management. Part of me felt guilty when I heard this, the part that had been trained from childhood to prioritize their needs and feelings over my own. But I reminded myself that they had created their situation through decades of choices, that they had burned bridges with multiple family members who might have helped them, and that offering them money now would only restart the cycle of demands and entitlement. I felt compassion for their struggles, but I also recognized that compassion doesn't mean rescuing people from the consequences of their actions, especially when those people have shown no willingness to change their behavior or take responsibility for their choices. Looking back now, almost 2 years after that dinner party, I can see how much I've grown and changed as a result of standing my ground. I'm more confident in my boundaries, more aware of manipulation tactics, more careful about who I let into my inner circle. I've built a chosen family of friends and partners and colleagues who add value to my life without demanding that I diminish myself to accommodate their expectations. The business continues to thrive, and I've expanded my role from pure operations to mentoring other young entrepreneurs, helping them avoid the pitfalls I encountered and encouraging them to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. I've shared my story selectively with other business owners who were facing similar family dynamics, and I've been surprised by how common these situations are. How many successful people are dealing with relatives who feel entitled to their earnings or achievements? There's a particular flavor of guilt that comes with succeeding beyond your family of origin's expectations, especially when they come from more modest circumstances or struggled financially during your childhood. People who haven't experienced it often don't understand the complexity of it, The way gratitude and obligation and love get tangled up with resentment and boundary setting and self-preservation. But those who have been through it recognize each other instantly, understand without judgment why you might have to limit contact with parents or siblings who can't be happy for you without also trying to benefit from you. So what did I learn from all of this? I learned that the people who truly love you will celebrate your success without trying to take credit for it or claim ownership of it. I learned that boundaries are not betrayals, even when people treat them as such. I learned that sometimes protecting yourself means disappointing people you love, and that's painful but necessary. I learned that the guilt you feel when standing up to unreasonable demands doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're doing something difficult. I learned that you can grieve a relationship even when the person is still alive, and that grief is valid and important. I learned that chosen family can be just as meaningful and more reliable than blood family, that the circumstances of your birth don't obligate you to tolerate abuse or exploitation. I learned that success is sweeter when it's truly yours, uncomplicated by debt or obligation or guilt. And I learned that the accountant asking for one simple number, one clear answer to a straightforward question, can change everything by cutting through emotional manipulation and getting to the factual heart of the matter. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you had family members who treated your success as their opportunity, who demanded things they didn't earn, who made you feel guilty for having boundaries? Comment below and share your experience because I genuinely want to know I'm not alone in this, and I think others need to know they're not alone either. Understanding this kind of family dynamic is so important because it affects not just your relationship with your parents or siblings, but your entire sense of self-worth and your ability to enjoy your own achievements without guilt or fear. If this story resonated with you, if it touched something in your heart or helped you feel less alone in your own struggles, please leave a like on this video. It really helps the channel reach more people who might need to hear this message, who might be dealing with similar situations and wondering if they're crazy or selfish for wanting to protect what they've built. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real experiences from real people navigating complicated family dynamics, business challenges, and personal growth, make sure you're subscribed to My Truth Revealed Tales. This channel is all about honest, raw storytelling that doesn't shy away from the messy, difficult parts of life. And your subscription means we can keep creating content that matters. Content that validates experiences people often keep hidden because they're ashamed or confused about what they're going through. Hit that notification bell too so you never miss a new story, because we're releasing content regularly, and each one explores different aspects of what it means to set boundaries, choose yourself, and build a life on your own terms even when the people around you don't understand or support your choices. The journey I've been on since that restaurant dinner has been transformative in ways I'm still discovering, and I'm grateful for the hard lessons even though I wouldn't wish the pain of them on anyone. I'm grateful for Jennifer's quick thinking and that one simple question about investment amounts that expose the truth so clearly nobody could deny it. I'm grateful for Marcus's eventual willingness to see our parents clearly and choose his own path. I'm grateful for Uncle Tom's validation and the other family members who have quietly supported me. I'm grateful for my girlfriend who showed me what healthy love looks like. I'm grateful for the business that I nearly let be taken from me but ultimately protected. And I'm even grateful for my parents, not for what they demanded or how they treated me, but for forcing me to get clear on my values and boundaries in a way that will serve me for the rest of my life. Their unreasonable demands became the catalyst for my most significant personal growth. And while I wish that growth could have come in a less painful way, I can't deny the strength and clarity I've gained from standing my ground when it mattered most. If you're facing a similar situation right now, if you have family members making unreasonable demands and trying to guilt you into compliance, please know that you're not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. You're not selfish for protecting what you've built. You're not ungrateful for having boundaries. You're not a bad person for saying no to people who haven't earned what they're demanding. And you're not alone, even when it feels like the whole world is against you and telling you that family should come first no matter what. Sometimes putting family first means putting your own well-being and integrity first, because you're family too, and you deserve to be treated with the same respect and care you're expected to extend to others. Thank you for watching, for listening, for being part of this community where we can share these difficult truths and support each other through the complicated reality of being human in a world that often demands we prioritize other people's comfort over our own dignity. Your comments, your likes, your subscriptions, they all matter more than you might realize because they create space for these conversations to happen, for people to feel less alone in their struggles, and for truth to be told even when it's uncomfortable or controversial. Until next time, Remember that your success is yours to define and yours to protect. And anyone who truly loves you will understand that.